All right, we're going to get started. Our next speaker is Duncan McConnell, and he's going to talk about environmental methods of simulation in paramedic education.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here in New Zealand, my first time. Thank you for all sort of coming in and as we continue on with our conversations in IRCP. My presentation's a little bit different, less about research and more about our development of future paramedics and application of other techniques with current serving paramedics as well. So looking at the environmental factors associated with how we implement simulation technology, scenarios and other things like that. One of our speakers earlier today, Chelsea, he's not in the room, but talking about the bat in the bag. This sort of caught my attention. Now, for our Australian paramedics in the room, especially those that have worked in far remote Queensland, I'm sure you've had your fair share of patients that have rocked up to you with a snake in the bag. Sometimes the snake's in two pieces, sometimes the snake's still moving in the bag, and the first thing you know about it is when they point it out in the ambulance beside you while you're treating them and wrapping up the snake bite. So yes, I've had my fair share of those, even where they've tried to kill the snake and ended up hurting themselves, but they still managed to catch the snake and limp in with the sort of stake through the foot, snake in the other hand. So it's interesting to see that other side of the world perspective where they might have bats where we have our snakes. So I found that very intriguing. Okay, so I've got a few things that I'll be mentioning today. So just from a basic disclaimer perspective, I'm not here to advertise any of the companies or any of the equipment that are mentioned here. So this is not a marketing ploy or anything like that. They just happen to be either examples of things I've come across and implemented in my own training workplace, or that's the equipment that we currently have in place to facilitate our simulation. So a little about me. I'm the Foundational Program Director of the Griffith University Bachelor of Paramedicine, one of the last paramedic degrees to be built in Australia and recently accredited by the CAA. I've now stepped away from that role as Program Director, working as a Senior Lecturer whilst trying to complete my PhD. So workload was very interesting, so something had to give. So I've now handed that over to a new Program Director, and my PhD studies is focusing around international ambulance models and comparison of those models in developed and developing countries. So I still work part-time with the Queensland Ambulance Service in the spare time that I have. And fellow academics in the room that sort of also maintain their clinical skill sets can sort of see that would be quite challenging with a PhD, senior lecturing and sometimes fitting in some ambulance work. Occasionally I sleep, and that's when I need a rest. But yes, working in the community paramedic capacity, and occasionally, if there's no spots in there, I'll still run around on trucks with everyone else. It's been a while since I've worked in a full-time capacity in the QAS, so I can work almost incognito with people not recognising who I once was, and I can just be a little Joe Blow ambulance officer floating around from case to case. It's quite lovely. Research interests, simulation methodologies, and as I mentioned before, international ambulance models and things like that, and I'll touch on that a little bit towards the end of the lecture today. So that little picture up there is our first graduating cohort from Griffith University's paramedic program. They graduated July 18 this year. 39 students graduated, and out of those 39 students, 24 already have jobs and started yesterday. The remaining decided not to do their application process until they finished all their studies. So they're in the final process now of going through the selection process in the various ambulance services in Australia. A few applied overseas. So it'd be interesting to see how many out of that initial 39 end up getting full-time employment. But 24 is not a bad start, I must say. So we're quite proud of them. Okay, so if I say the word simulation, what would most people in this room say? So feel free to stick your hand. We don't need a microphone, just yell it out. It's all good. Fairly relaxed.
Resuscitation.
Resuscitation, what else?
Rubber nollie land.
What was that, sorry?
Rubber nollie land.
Yep. What else? Come on.
Scenario.
Scenario? What about cost? Cost would probably be the first. I'll put my MBA hat on now and my Master of Commerce hat on. Cost would probably be one of the first things that comes into a manager's perspective. And the other thing sort of associated with cost, I would say return on investment. So what's the point of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on this equipment if it sits there and gathers dust? So managers in the room, would you say cost would be a fairly significant aspect of your implementation of simulation? What about training? It's all very well you spend thousands of dollars on equipment and thousands of dollars on training people, but what happens when that person moves on? Where does that knowledge go? How is that passed on? Okay, aspects like that. So from a simulation perspective, the other things like logistics, where do you store it? These mannequins aren't big, and if you look at any of the new medium to high fidelity mannequins that are available today, you will see they come inside boxes that are almost stand as high as you. And that's just the upper torso. The bottom torso, the legs, is the same. So you've got space to store this stuff. So that causes an issue. You've got building scenarios. Who builds them? Who maintains them? How do you maintain the currency of what's happening? Effectiveness of scenario. So what are your learning objectives, outcomes? How are you going to achieve that? So it's a fairly basic, broad overview of how simulation works. If you ask the average student paramedic or the average paramedic on the road, I don't think too many of them would come up with many of, other than the cost, I don't think too many of them will come up with the other aspects of what we have up there today. So, simulation, how does it work for you? Well, everyone in this room will have a different aspect of how simulation can be applied and beneficial to your organisation. From a university perspective, working in the undergraduate space, so these are people straight out of high school, some have other degrees, some have decided to change careers. We apply it from a fundamental basic all the way up to high acuity to their level. Okay, so particularly for the students that we graduate, we try to graduate a student that's at that ACP level, skill set, but have an understanding and knowledge of the next skill set above them should they require assistance. So they're not just, so if they get a patient that's sort of above their ability to treat, manage and care, they know why they need to call that next level of care or that consultation line to bring in the assistance they need. So that's how we have our simulation work for us. But we don't just sit there with our basic plastic rubber mannequins and other aspects like that. We incorporate many of the environmental factors that I'm going to talk about today. So, rattle off some environmental factors or methods and things. What would you say they would be? Feel free to yell that out again. How would you identify that in a simulation perspective? What would you say an environmental factor is?
Noise.
Noise. What else?
Temperature.
Temperature?
Light.
Light?
English.
English, that's very good. And we actually have a defibrillator that we use occasionally that's in English and Spanish. And it is great when you turn that AED on and start speaking to the students in Spanish because they just look at it and go, what do I do? Where realistically, follow the flashing light. It's not that hard. Alright, so weather. Someone mentioned weather. That is quite interesting because many of the scenarios that students do, it's done in a room not that dissimilar to what we have here. So how do we take advantage of it? Now, in Queensland, it can be quite challenging to get a rainy day on most days. Okay, it doesn't rain very often. It's winter apparently at the moment, and I got sunburnt last week. I'm not sure how that happens in winter, but maybe it's my Scottish skin. But taking advantage of different aspects of the weather on a training day. So you could walk into your room like this, and it's raining, or there's some other inclement weather that gives you the ability to go, actually, the scenario we're doing today, why don't we incorporate that with a bit of external weather? Why don't we add a bit of complexity in that space and take advantage of it in that direction? Surrounds. Okay, so that initial photo there, we've got basic paramedics that responded, they're first on scene, simple scenario. But what happens when you add copious amounts of people? You add an aggressor, or you add something else that changes surrounds. One aspect of pre-hospital care that's completely different from the in-hospital environment is the clear fact that nothing about our workplace is straightforward. It is a complete and utterly uncontrolled workplace. No matter how secure, no matter how straightforward or support that you have in place with you, our workplace is the most uncontrolled workplace that you could possibly get in a medical situation. No situation you have gone to in your years of working as paramedics would be the same, even if it was the same job or same job type. So sounds. Okay, so working on a sound capacity, how can sounds be annoying? How annoying can sounds be? Okay? It can completely distract you from what you're doing. You're not able to focus on what you're doing. Is anything I'm going to shut the child up? How do we make a child that's crying? How do we make a child that's crying stop? What do we need to do? Okay? Add a crying child in this scenario. What would be one thing we would do, or get a paramedic to do, to make that child go quiet?
Pick it up.
So we want to pick up the child.
Pick it up.
It's annoying, isn't it? Okay, but it's a simple thing. We pick the child up, we're comforting it. Okay, we're making it feel better. And sorry, I had to do that. My bad. So we pick the child up and we comfort it. It's not that difficult, but how distracting was that, listening to me present up here with a screaming child in the background? So little simple things like that. Now that mannequin that I brought in here is just a standard Layardell Resusci infant mannequin. Nothing fancy about it. You can pump some air into it. You can do some two-fingered CPR just to practice that aspect. And all I did was pull out the central chest rise and fall section of the child, stick in a little JBL speaker that runs off Bluetooth. Bada boom, I've got myself a little environmental factored infant that we can sit in a pram in a corner of a room or something like that to add as an environmental distraction associated with that particular scenario. So, and that comes back to the sound. So that's an example of life cast mannequins which are based over in the UK. And just up there, they've got a little Bluetooth speaker inside the child's head. Okay, so coming back to cost, high fidelity and medium fidelity mannequins are quite expensive. But if you've got something already in your workplace that maybe the mannequin's broken, and I've got an example of that later on, you can take advantage of those other mannequins to actually incorporate some of these factors as part of your simulation process. So don't think the old broken sitting in the corner doesn't work anymore mannequin is useless. There's aspects where you can actually use them as a dirty mannequin, or as, like we just had before there, as a crying child mannequin. They're still of use to your organisation, so you can reinvest money that you've already spent back into education and technology at a very simplistic level. So instead of going out and spending another $3,000 on a new bit of equipment, you could spend $30 or $40 on a new Bluetooth speaker, for example, and throw it in there. Or you could put some weight inside that mannequin to make it weigh more and use it as an external outside extrication device, where the learning objectives of that would be working together as a crew. So, real people, simulated patients. How many people in this room actually use simulated patients for educational purposes, be it for qualified paramedics or for student paramedics? Put your hands up. So about a quarter of the room. Now, for those that do it quite regularly, the impact of simulated patients on your student, or be it a qualified student or be it a new graduate student, the impact a real person has on their approach to patient care is absolutely astronomical. So I'll use an example of one of the students that's graduated. He was a very quiet student. He was our oldest student. He was 52. And his connection with the particular topic we were working on, we were a bit concerned. We added a simulated patient to this particular scenario, and he was the best student by far over everyone in that cohort. So he went from quite reserved to being able to communicate with this patient, to be able to actually relate to what that patient was saying. And we understood that when we spoke to him later on, he says, I just can't relate to a plastic mannequin. I just can't relate to those fake situations. But when I'm with a real person, I can open up, I can understand what they're listening, what they're trying to tell me, I can empathise, and I can get into the heart of the problem because I'm actually dealing with a real person. It's irrelevant that everything they're saying is made up. I can actually relate and apply my foundational knowledge and skills to actually treat a real person. And in certain environments and scenarios and situations that I teach in, I will not assess them unless I have a real simulated patient. And a great example of that has been old care, or older adults, and mental health patients. Okay? So unless you've got hundreds of thousands of dollars and you can make the mannequin chase people around the room, good luck having a simulated patient that's a mannequin in a mental health or acute behavioural disturbance kind of situation. Where with a real person, it provides that sense of realism and an approach where they actually have to go through with it. So, time management. Now, for those that came to IRCP over in Las Vegas, I did a presentation on interprofessional learning in simulation. And that's where our paramedical students worked with medical students, so future doctors, and they worked in a scenario where we completed the pre-hospital care aspect of the scenario, then we handed over to the medical students, and then there were other people within the health group, such as our allied sciences, nursing students, and people in that direction that continued on with that scenario for a week. But a key part of that scenario was an aspect that we do every day as paramedics and don't really consider much about it in relation to training. And that's EPCR, or your electronic patient care reporting, or patient care records, whatever your terminology might be. Now, for those paramedics that are still operational within this room, what would you say your average write-up time would be when you get to the hospital before someone starts harassing you, be it the communication centre, the nurse, the doctor? What would be about 25, 30 minutes? Be an average? I see some nods around the room. So what we do with this is when the students have completed the pre-hospital care management of this patient, they have to write up the actual scenario, or what they've done in treatment, management, the works, in an actual live industry EPCR. Now we use MediView, which is from Beyond Lucid Technologies over in the States. And they write that up and they're given a time limit. And if they don't meet that time limit, people come and start knocking on the door. They come on, hurry up, we need that EPCR. Why haven't you finished yet? And it gets them used to being able to complete these in a timely manner. Now we do provide some training and assistance for them how to use it before we throw them into these kind of scenarios. But we get them into the habit of being able to complete these concisely and quickly to provide what they need. And it's a legal document, and we reinforce that. And other aspects that we incorporate into our program as well is within written assessments as well. So we'll do case-based learning scenarios which are integrated blended learning videos and things online, and they'll have to complete the EPCR as part of their clinical assessment. And it provides up to a 40% assessment mark in the overall mark of that assessment, because it plays a major chunk. Between driving and writing reports, they're probably the two biggest things that we do as paramedics. Our actual clinical interventions and time with patient is actually probably only about 10% of what we do with our patient each time we meet them. Now, we can't simulate the driving aspect at our university, so that'll be left to the organisation when they go. But we can provide some assistance in their clinical documentation. Okay, so incorporating some of these factors into our simulation. So, one aspect that we look, and I'm sure every organisation's got a different approach to this, but my application to this over the years has been, why are we here today? What are we trying to achieve? What are the benefits to the students? What are the benefits to the paramedics? What are our benefits to new, updating current practices? And what's the best way to deliver this in that section? Troubleshooting. I've spent years working in the electronic space, and I've got to say, no matter how best laid your plans are in implementing something that's electronic or something that's associated with a computer, I did expect the baby not to start crying today. But something always goes wrong. It's just part of modern technology. You can't have electronics without something going wrong. So you need a good foolproof plan in place to ensure that you can work around that should something happen, particularly if it's an assessment part. And one thing that we encountered was we started using the Label ALS SimMed. They were the mannequins we incorporated into our program when we built it back in 2016. Now, the aspect with them, for those that haven't used them before, is the old mannequins used to have the studs where you connect your cables on, you push your DFib, and away you would go. These new mannequins, the studs were removed, and they used a technology called SimLink, which were real pads that you would put over the same spot, and it would communicate via Bluetooth, and that's how you would actually deliver your shot. However, because of our university's intense wireless network and other technologies that were floating around, we had constant disconnection and other things like that before we were able to work a good workaround. So when we did exams with these, there's actually a remote control as well as an app on your phone. So if there was any disconnection, and we did have some disconnections in some of these assessments, we had a workaround so that we could immediately override the Wi-Fi and talk directly to the SimLink device so the students could continue on with their simulation with minimal disruption. And if you ask the students that had a disruption, most of them didn't even identify there was one because the troubleshooting and action plan was put in place so well that it was able to seamlessly move across throughout the scenario. And the other things we need to look at is your team or team's environment, location, appropriate notification. How many people have done a scenario in a public place and they've missed notifying a key aspect of your surrounds and you end up with police, fire, security and heaven knows what else turning up on the scene, very angry. Who's had that before? Yeah? It's interesting, isn't it? I've had, we've had a couple of hanging scenarios where police have rocked up lights and sirens and ambulances have come as well because Jobo Public has seen ex-mannequin, which we thought we hid and covered quite well for the protection of the general public. However, not so much. Okay, so it is important that you notify, you have your notification stuff set in place because it can become quite embarrassing, especially if it's an assessment, because it just disrupts and throws the whole day out. And probably the most important part that I think focuses around simulation is your closing aspects, your debriefing, your reflection. If you're not going to incorporate that into your training aspect, don't bother doing the simulation because you're really not going to get anything out of the actual simulation or the process you're putting forward. Because if there's no chance for a debrief on what was good, what could be better, or reflection on what you've done, how are you assessing or how are you trying to bring in the learning objectives or outcomes that you're trying to implement throughout that process? And I think that's probably one of the most important factors of any simulation is how you put that in practice. So let's do a couple of just straightforward, simple scenarios that we have done over the years. Now, I just want to point out this little aspect right here. So for those of you used to using these sort of mannequins, it's not connected to anything. Okay? This mannequin is unconnected, it's not turned on, but we've got, I'll talk about that in a minute, but who knows what that is? We've got blood, what else we got? That's $10 worth of steak out of Coles. Okay? So it's to simulate compound fracture. That's a bit of meat. Alright, throw a bit of meat on there. The objective of this scenario was obviously 9-year-old reversed over by an SUV. Pretty common and horrible incident, I must admit. But the environmental factors here, because there's no sound associated with it, their car was still running. Okay? There was a screaming baby in the background. The speaker was actually hidden underneath the stroller. And there was a significant hemorrhage, which we'll show you in a minute. Okay, so the learning objectives and outcomes of this particular scenario were twofold. Initially, it was the initial treatment of the patient. So identify the dangers. We still had the child running. We had to get rid of the car. Okay, we had to turn that off. Identify the catastrophic hemorrhage. If that wasn't solved, the patient was going to die. And then the third part, so there are our environmental factors. And then the third part was related to high acuity level response. So in Queensland, that's our critical care paramedics coming in and doing that high-end blood replacement, all of that kind of stuff. So that was a separate, because that was a twofold scenario. So the students were also greeted with the crowd, okay, so the surrounds. And somewhere in the background there, over there somewhere, I was in the background being a hindrance, being a very unhelpful father. But the real kicker was getting the students to identify this. So this is our mannequin, and can you see in here? So that's how we were simulating our bleed. Now, anyone bleeding that quickly, quite frankly, of a child of that size, is going to bleed out pretty quick. Okay, but the way we did that was just a simple little pool pump, and we just filled some water through it. And the moment a cat tourniquet was actually applied, it went over the actual hose and actually stopped it. Okay, so we needed that leg sorted out with a cat tourniquet. We were happy with just an Israeli bandage and other sort of clogging devices on the other leg because it wasn't as bad. But this is a mannequin that's not plugged in. Now, we weren't after the sounds, we weren't after the ECG, we weren't after any of that, we were after the physical application of dealing with the immediate life threat. And then further on, there was another mannequin set up with all that stuff turned on. But simple. I mean, that mannequin you could say it's broken. Okay, the electronics don't work anymore. It doesn't mean it's not useful in other aspects of your simulation where you can throw environmental factors. In fact, when the mannequins aren't functioning, and you're not worried about destroying your $100,000 electronic equipment, you can do some pretty cool stuff outside. Immersions, dirty, you can really contextualise what you're trying and have a lot of fun with it. Quite frankly, money is an aspect when it comes to you designing your simulations, but probably the other biggest aspect is just how creative you are. And I have a bit of an evil laugh when it comes to thinking of certain simulation styles and scenarios, because you can, if you're very creative, there's no real limit to what you can do in that space. So, who saw an article published about 2.5 months ago, for our overseas visitors in America and Canada, who saw an article about United Airlines putting a restriction on their assistance animals on flights? Who saw that article? Who had a bit of a giggle? I'm not sure why I need my assistant snake. I've never heard of an assistant miniature horse. And why do you have a winged assistant animal that you would allow onto a plane in the first place, I'm really not sure. So that sort of made my morning. However, we decided there was a couple of aspects that we have done over the time. And going back to our older adult patients, we've got Eddie, our little Jack Russell, and yes, Eddie from Fraser, in case anyone's wondering. And this mannequin we've got on the table there is simulating a 90-year-old woman. I'm simulating the 90-year-old husband. I look very good for a 90-year-old, I must say. And the goal of this scenario was death, dying, and grief. So I've woken up in the morning. My wife's still asleep, so I think. And I'm going to go make her a cup of tea, come back, wake her up, etc., etc. I come back, she doesn't respond. I call the ambulance. I don't know what else to do. Ambulance crew rocks up, and they're greeted with my wife asleep in the bed, and our dog sitting on top of it. Dog refuses to move. Gotta love dog food. He wouldn't move for anyone. It's great. Okay, so basically the crew comes in, they put on the pads, they identify the patient's dead. They then have to, or was passed away in his sleep, they then have to do that with the dog around. They weren't allowed to move the dog, and the dog wasn't going to move to save them even if they tried. Because the moment a couple of crews did pick him up and put him down, and he jumped back up on the stretcher. And he did that because he is a food-motivated fat Russell, is what I refer to him. He's not Jack Russell, he's a fat Russell, he's an overweight Jack Russell. So they had to then break that news to the patient's husband, which is me. Now, simplistic, cost me about 50 cents worth of dog food. The dog was more than happy to come to work with me. That mannequin is a dirty mannequin, i.e. it has no electronics in it, there's no airway in it, it's nothing. It's just a drag and drop mannequin. We borrowed the wig from medicine, threw a blanket over it, used the stretcher as a bed. Okay, simplistic. I'm sure all of you in this room would have that amount of equipment you could very quickly put together. And the impact for this was low cost, high impact. And pretty much everyone in that group that went through, the 42 students who went through that day, none had ever broken to a patient's spouse that their loved one of 60 plus years had died. Now, how do you teach that? How do you broach that? How did I learn? I listened to what others said, spoke to people, reflected and that type of stuff. So we used that as a way of educating on how they would approach that. Okay, so it's before the police got there. And it's a common thing that we do if we rock up to scenes and we pronounce someone dead. It's often before police or other services are there that take on their formal responsibility. But how do you break that news? So that scenario was all about managing the death and grieving, managing the animal, and breaking that kind of news to the patient. And a few of the students broke down because they found it quite challenging. But at the end of it, they were very appreciative of the way that it came through. And then we had the other scenario where he was the assistance dog, returned veteran. I can't go anywhere without the dog. I won't put the dog down. You are going to have to manage me holding the dog. Okay? And that was interesting. Eddie has never seen any of this equipment before, and every time they put something on me, he'd paw at it or try and pull it off with his mouth. And he did that without me prompting him. He was just a curious dog. We often refer to him as a suicidal dog because he eats anything and everything. I'm glad I have a wife as a vet because he has eaten Nurofen, Panadol, pretty much anything he can get his hands on. And yes, I keep that type of stuff secured. He unzips bags. So the Nurofen in particular, he actually unzipped my bag and got it out because there was other food in there that he thought he would eat. So yeah, Jack Russells, if you have one, you've got to give them a job, otherwise they get busy and create their own work. So that's all very well with our small dogs. But what do we do if you walk in and they've got a giant dog? This is Zeus, a Great Dane from Canada. Okay, so he played the role of an assistance dog. And that had to do with cardiac arrest. Now, I'm sorry I couldn't get the photo of him over one of the students with about a kilo worth or litre worth of drool going down their shirt. Absolutely brilliant. So can you imagine, those of you that don't, who's got a bit of a phobia against big dogs when you walk into a scene? Stick your hands in the air. Yeah, they're a bit freaky, aren't they? Now, Zeus, he would be almost the height of this lectern. Okay, so he is a big boy. Students didn't see him. They walked into the room and then met with this horse. Okay, so a few of them freaked out. One of them refused to come in, but eventually we coached them and said, look, he's a gentle giant. And we just proceeded through the scenario with Zeus being the assistance dog. Okay? And then he had enough at the end of the day. But just little simple things like that. Granted, all of this was done in a classroom, and we didn't have all of the rooms set up like a lounge room or other aspects like that, but it was more just adding in the physical dog. It's all very well running a scenario where you go, okay, so there's a dog in the house, there's a little dog is barking at you, what do? We're physically getting them to actually manage the situation with a real event so that when they turn up to these situations, they're better prepared. They know what to do as opposed to walking in having one of those, oh my God, what do I do moments. And that's a key aspect of implementing simple things like that. Now I know there's probably plenty of people in this room like Auckland and Patrick that do similar things like that. And somehow I don't think the organisation would have that much of an issue with you implementing simple things like that as long as your animals aren't going to sort of maul or eat people, so to speak. So this is London Hems. And back when I was looking at PhD topics to do, one of the areas I was looking at was virtual reality-based simulation. And one of my actual projects now, which we'll see shortly, is actually being implemented by Monash University, which is great to see your research being implemented somewhere else. It's a bit of a compliment. So one thing that caught my eye with London Hems is how many people in this room run helicopter retrieval services or medical retrieval services around the room? Who's got a helicopter attached there yet? Quite a few of you. So it's an expensive business to run, is it not? So how do you train crews? How do you maintain certain aspects of training? So London Hems had this very interesting concept that they've implemented as a trial, which they've since kept going, where they took a broken mannequin, that's what they tested with it originally, and they put it in a standard situation that they would come across quite regularly. The whole purpose of that scenario was to get paramedics, air crew, and doctors to work together in a crew resource management way to actually extricate said patient, work together on whatever was wrong with that patient, and bring it back to the helicopter. The helicopter bit of taking off, flying and landing at the hospital was utterly irrelevant. It was all about getting that crew resource management put together. And they worked out the cost per scenario, if you took out the wages of the personnel, was about $110 a scenario. Now, I've got a bit of an aviation background, and I know a helicopter like that is anywhere between $5,500 to $6,500 an hour to fly. So that's pretty decent money in relation to crew resource management training and getting your crews work together. And the key thing about this was that they weren't worried about what the pilots needed to do to maintain their proficiency. They were getting a bit of transient confusion with new paramedic staff, new medical staff, and new aircrew staff working amongst each other. And they need to come up with a simplistic way of actually applying a very cost-effective training solution so that any new members could work together and establish good crew resource management situations. because there's nothing worse, and as a pilot myself, there's nothing worse than the two of you having completely different ideas when your aircraft is falling apart around you, okay? And having experienced undercarriage failure before, and trying to manage that with two of us, was quite a challenging work environment. But what I found most alarming was the look of disappointment on the fire service, ambulance service, and police service when I successfully landed the aircraft. It was all, oh, now we've got nothing to do. I mean, I was happy with the fact they had nothing to do, but they all seemed kind of disappointed. Okay, so Great Western Air Ambulance Charity. They have a very interesting thing. Now, I've learnt from our Saskatoon presentation that if we put music that's from someone else on here, they block the stream. So I've muted this, but this is their crew practicing with the sound. Okay, I've been having to do an intubation in a very noisy environment. So these two are rocking out to Bon Jovi in noise cancelling earphones, and they're doing this activity completely without verbal communication. Okay, so very straightforward, but high impact, low cost, high impact. Simple environmental factors, and again, those of you that have helicopters in your service, a very simple technique that could be used to help develop this type of crew resource management training. Still going. So yeah, it's a very, very simple and effective technique. There we go. All right. So immersive environments, that's our simulator, our ambulance simulator. So is there anyone in this room that's got a university with an immersive room where all the walls turn on and the roof turns on? Yep, they're pretty awesome, aren't they? It completely changes the whole aspect of what you're doing. You can turn a standard room into a swimming pool or into a busy street or something like that, and they work really well. This is our immersive ambulance simulator, which Monash University has since copied and implemented with their program as well. And that simulator is a completely fully functioning working interior ambulance, right down to oxygen, electricity, the works. And the windows are actually large screen TVs which emulate movement. I don't have the hydraulics turned on at the moment, but without the hydraulics functioning, the illusion of movement is that real that students have got sick riding in it. Because as it accelerates, you see people bracing. As it decelerates, you see them bracing. They go up to do CPR and you see them grabbing something to try and stay straight. And it puts them inside an ambulance itself, but it's all very well we do certain aspects of our training and skill development in a classroom. What happens when you shrink the size of that classroom down and you use real dimensions and you throw in multiple factors to try and make it work? So our interprofessional pathway that I mentioned before, that comes back to our time management. So that's another way that we sort of throw the factors of time management, doctors, hospital environments, all that aspect as well. And that's what I spoke more about in 2017 in IRCP in Las Vegas, and that one's online at IRCP if you want to have a look at that. And again, that's our time management space as well. So agency collaboration, Dr. Ashford, who is the Medical Director of Queensland Ambulance Service, very impressed with the way the simulator actually works and looking at implementing collaboration with our simulator with their high acuity and critical care level paramedics to change the way in which they approach their work. And over there on the right, or left, sorry, we've got collaboration with the fire service in their state training facility as well. Just to create, because our university gets a little bit upset when we start cutting up cars in the car park. Apparently it's not a good picture to have. And we've been fighting for a while to try and have some bent cars in secluded areas, but as look, it's not a good image to have bent and twisted cars in our university. We like our clean, pristine buildings. And when we try to put them inside a big workshop or a big shed or something like that, oh no, we don't have the space. So that costs us about $800 an hour to have a fire crew, safety officers, and a few other minor things associated with it, so that our students can go and spend 8 hours worth of training on real cars and other things like that. So cost-benefit analysis from a manager's perspective, I think it would be better if we had our own internally located. So that's pretty much on my aspects of simulation, and sort of where I'm going to finish my IRCP journey talking about simulation over the past 4 years. Next year, I'm going to be focusing more on my PhD research. And that's to do with international ambulance models and a comparison between developed and developing countries. So one of the areas I am looking at is community paramedicine in developing countries. And at the moment I'm working in Mongolia and the Maldives with support from countries in the UK, US, Canada and Australia on how that actually works. So it's a very exciting project. I have no shortage of people that wish to be research assistants in either the Maldives or Mongolia. Can't understand why there seems to be more for the Maldives than Mongolia. But it is interesting to see how they actually apply their ambulance service within their country's needs. And having participated a few times in some of these areas, someone that grew up in a very developed country like Australia, it certainly made my eyes almost pop out of my head with a few things that you came across and saw, just when it just came down to basic equipment that we take for granted, and how they contextualise what they have to facilitate what they need. So that's my contact details. If you would like to get in touch, and I'm happy to take any questions if there's time. I think I went a bit too long, Gary.
Yeah, we'll catch the questions.
No worries.